the central processing unit. In this lesson, we're going to look at the purpose of the CPU, including how it deals with input. It will then be shown where the CPU is in a computer by taking one apart. And finally, you will evaluate the input of the CPU on the performance of a computer. For this lesson, you will need pen and paper. In this lesson, you will define the purpose of the CPU, demonstrate the location of the CPU in a PC, and evaluate the impact of the CPU. We're going to start with defining the purpose of the CPU. Now, the CPU, or Central Processing Unit, is the device that carries out all the processing within a computer. Now, the main job of the CPU is to execute program instructions using the fetch, decode, execute cycle. The way this works is instructions are fetched one by one from memory into the processor, along with any required data. The processor then decodes or works out what needs to be done and carries out each of those instructions before going back and fetching the next instruction from memory. And that's why it's a cycle. It goes over and over again. Let's consider an example of the whole process. So the letter B is typed in a keyboard and sent to the computer. Now obviously the keyboard is that input device that we learnt about last lesson. The CPU calculates how to display the letter B by requesting step-by-step instructions from memory, which tell it how to draw the letter B. The CPU runs these instructions. The result of this is then sent to the screen, which displays the letter B. I'm now going to demonstrate to you the location of the CPU in a PC. Now, starting with the first picture, when you first take the cover off a computer, this is what it will look like inside. Now, the section that we're concentrating on is underneath the fan. Now, this is where the CPU is located. Now, there are 4 screws that hold the fan in place that must need to be removed before we can get to the CPU. Once removed the fan, we can see the CPU underneath. Now, the CPU is held in place by this arm, which if you push down and pull sideways, it will release the CPU. So once we remove the CPU, you can look at first of all the back of it. Now the back has a thermal compound on it. Now when we're touching the CPU, we need to be careful not to touch this. On the front of the CPU, it has, in this case, pads that connect to the socket. Now different CPU makes may have pins instead of pads. Now the socket has the pins. But again, because obviously some CPUs may have pins, the same goes for the socket. Now different models of CPU need different sockets, and together they are called the chipset. But the key thing is one must have pins, one must have pads for it to work. The last part we're going to consider is the heatsink. Now what the purpose of the heatsink, which is located between the fan and the CPU, is to take the heat away from the processor. Because remember, the CPU is a very hard working piece of equipment. It literally will run millions, if not billions, of instructions every single second. And of course, the harder it works, the hotter it will get. Therefore, the heatsink combined with the fan is needed to take this heat away in order to stop the computer from overheating, particularly the CPU. We're now going to evaluate the impact of the CPU. Your task needs to be completed on paper. Now for developing, I want you to consider what happens when you touch something very hot. Now this is actually called the reflex arc in a person, and you can look this up online and it may help you to answer the question. So I want you to imagine your body was a computer and consider how it would react. The way you're going to do this, you're going to write a tweet showing about one of the following hashtags. So you can choose between, so hashtag input is like heat, or hashtag process is like brain, or hashtag output is like arm moving. So choose one of those and write a tweet. You only need to do one of them. Moving on to secure level. I'll give you two specifications for computers. Now the first specification has a 4 GB RAM and a 4 GHz CPU. The second computer specification has 4 GB of RAM and 3 GHz CPU. What I want you to do is I would like you to compare the performance of the two CPUs. In this comparison, you need to consider which one you think is faster and why, and which do you think will get hotter and why. Finally, your mastered level task. I would like you to explain how the CPU and the fetch, decode, execute cycle might work in a device you use daily. Choose any device and explain how it might work. When you have completed the task, I'd like you to take a screenshot or photo for uploading to ClassCharts. You can pause the video now to go away and complete this task. The final thing you need to do is complete the exit quiz, which you will find linked on ClassCharts. When you have completed the quiz, you will need to take a screenshot or photo for uploading to ClassCharts. So in conclusion, to complete this lesson, you must upload the results of your task from your paper and the results of your exit quiz. Both must be uploaded to complete the lesson.